we're gonna... Well, good morning to all of you, and a very warm welcome, and thank you also to the Southbank Centre and to WOW for organising this kind of incredible space for all of us to engage on issues that affect all of our lives. So I'm really happy to be here and very happy to meet the women on the panel today. So as you know, the theme is Activism Without Borders, and we're just going to get right in. I know we're running late, but we are going to end on time at 1. So thank you for your patience in terms of the 10 minutes that we lost. So my name is Jessica Horn, and I am a feminist activist, very involved in African feminist activism, but also I have, all of my work in a way is transnational. So it's really a great pleasure to be engaging in this discussion. Just so you know, format-wise, each of us is going to present, we're going to have a bit of a dialogue amongst ourselves, but then also we really very much want to open it to questions from all of you and to engage in a dialogue with all of you. As you know, issues of women's rights, issues of feminism and activism are about our lives. And so I would encourage you to get over the normal London shyness and just do your thing. Roll up your sleeves and get in there. Because again, this is about our world. So, you know, warmly welcome to engage. So to start off, I just wanted to show 4 quick slides because I was having a think about the idea of activism without borders. And I know that very often, particularly for younger people, we have a sense that activism started yesterday. You know, it's a new thing. You know, it's enabled by social media, and that people were not necessarily organizing transnationally historically. You know, and it's just good to remember that, particularly in feminist activism and in the history of feminism, people have always mobilized across borders. So I just wanted to show a few quick slides to that effect. Now, I have a little secret love for women in, like, radical women in fluffy dresses. So herewith, the socialist feminists who actually first proposed to have an International Women's Day. That was in 1910. An International Women's Day was then organized the next year, but it was actually Russian women, Russian laborers, organizing a labor rights march that then became, in essence, the Russian Revolution. And it was on the equivalent of the 8th of March. And so that is actually the origin of tomorrow. But again, that's in the 1900s. This, I think, is incredible. Somali women in Mogadishu in the 1970s in a free Angela Davis rally. So again, this is no email, you know, no text messages, no international, you know, communication to mobilize, and Somali women are mobilizing for the freedom of black feminist Black Panther in America. Our very own Claudia Jones. Again, individuals are often very critical in our activism, in our international activism. Claudia Jones was a Trinidadian. We often know her as the mother of Notting Hill Carnival. But she mobilized, again, in leftist spaces, but an anti-racist, pro-feminist left organizing in the Caribbean, in the United States, and in the United Kingdom. And again, a diaspora organizing a long time before it was easy to travel. Of course, in the history of international work, in particular the constructing international law and international policy frameworks, women's activism across borders has been central. The Nairobi Women's Conference, which is, of course, one of the big UN conferences that kind of kicked us off on this wave, but even to the 1990s, the Vienna Tribunal, when women, in essence, organized a tribunal of women speaking to testify in a kind of mock legal tribunal to make the case that women's rights were human rights. It took the international community that long to actually officially acknowledge that violations by non-state actors, violations in the private sphere, and a lot of the claims that women make in terms of human rights were actually valid human rights claims. And the tech. And lastly to today, this is just some images from Nasawiya, which is a Lebanese feminist collective based in Beirut. A lot of young feminists organizing on intersectional issues, and again a solidarity with their sisters in Egypt around the sexual harassment and violence in the street, around the revolution, and also some of the imagery that they have created, which again in a way shows the legacy and co-inspirations of feminist activists across borders. So with that little piece of history, I wanted to start and to welcome the speakers. Our first speaker is Anne Summers. She is a best-selling author, Australian, but has worked in Australia, in Europe, and the United States. She's a journalist, a thought leader. She's had a long career in politics and the media, in business, and also in the non-governmental sector, and I know she's been quite involved in Greenpeace. She's written a lot of books with fantastic names, the latest of which is The Misogyny Factor. And she is editor and publisher of the digital magazine Anne Summers Reports. And she also hosts Anne Summers Conversations, where she engages in discussions with well-known people on a range of issues. So I'd like to welcome her to present her.
Thank you, Jessica. I'd just like to reassure the audience, this English audience, that I have no connection with them. If I had, I'd be a lot richer and probably wouldn't be sitting here. No, but every time I come through customs at Heathrow, there's usually some joke made about vibrators or underwear or what have you. But no, I'm the Anne Summers from Down Under, and I have been involved in the women's movement since 1969. And as Jessica mentioned, I've worked as an activist, I've worked in government, I've worked for Prime Ministers Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. I've been involved in setting up various women's activities, including the first women's refuge in Sydney, the Sydney Rape Crisis Centre, and various publications. And I feel a little bit humbled by the company that I'm in today, and I think I'm here to learn more than I am to be able to say very much. But I would like to just make 2 points based on my experience of activism, and one is that it is certainly true, as Jessica says, that women and feminists have always organised at an international level where we could, but I do remember back in the 60s and more particularly the 70s that it used to take a bloody long time. I remember it would take 6 weeks for our copies of Spare Rib to arrive from London. Likewise, the radical publications that we used to get from the United States, there was a women's liberation newspaper called Off Our Backs, and we used to avidly wait for each issue to come by snail mail, and there was absolutely no other way of getting information. If we wanted to organise amongst ourselves, we had what was called as a telephone tree, and which meant I would ring 3 people and they would each ring 3 people, and some of you here nodding your heads, you remember telephone trees, and I tell you what, I do not miss the good old days one bit. I'd much rather do a mass emailing than have to do a telephone tree. But I think that one of the things that I am very conscious of is that the ability that we now have through social media and through things like email to be able to, and through the World Wide Web, of course, to be able to learn instantly about what is happening around the world is a very, very precious tool, and one that I think we probably all would say unreservedly has made things better for us. But I think that there are certain, perhaps, myths around the benefits that we must be careful not to delude ourselves that because we have the ability to know what's happening in the Sudan or in Egypt or in the United States or India or whatever country it is, that we are actually able to be very useful in those countries. I think that knowledge is one thing, but the ability to be an activist on an international scale, is another thing, and one thing that I hope we'll be talking about in this panel. Because I feel, for example, just let me give you a couple of examples. One was, and I'm sorry I don't have in my head the young lady's name, but the woman who was raped and murdered on the bus in India about 18 months ago, there was absolute worldwide outpouring of rage and grief and anger about what happened, but there was nothing we could do. there was absolutely nothing we could do except express that rage. So that's one of our challenges. How do we translate our knowledge and our emotions and our political stances into relevant action across borders? The second thing I would say is that despite the technological ability to communicate, we still have the old-fashioned barriers of language. And these are formidable obstacles. And the third barrier, of course, is political cultures and the actions of governments which try and prevent us from doing things. And so I'm not trying to be a pessimist here, but I do want to I just don't want us to get too carried away with, oh, we're on Twitter, wow. I think it's fantastic, and it's wonderful the way in which revolutions can organise within their own countries using these technologies, but whether or not we can use them effectively across borders, I think is what we're here to discuss today.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Anne. And again, this is some of the stuff that we can certainly raise in the dialogue and absolutely talk about as well, if the Facebook like is equivalent to expressing active solidarity. Brilliant. So thank you very much for that. We're going to turn now to Nimco Ali. Nimco is a social media network coordinator for the End FGMC social change campaign, which is a campaign that's supported by the British Department for International Development. But she has been an anti-FGM activist for a very long time, and she's the co-founder and director of Daughters of Eve, which is a very creative anti-FGM organization. I remember you had a display last year, actually, here at WOW. And she's doing a range of things, including studying for a PhD. Brilliant. So welcome, Nimco.
I'm also associated with vaginas all the time, but that's because I talk about them all the time. And essentially, in terms of Activism Without Borders is a great kind of title to come here, because the campaigning work I've been doing is actually to acknowledge the fact that oppression against women has no borders, and it's actually the same whether it's happening in sub-Saharan Africa or whether it's happening on the streets of London. And to give you a context in terms of why I kind of became an activist, I think I was always kind of part of a family of feminists that did not necessarily raise their voices loud enough, but their voices were present in my life. So when I was at the age of 7, I went on holiday to Somalia, and I was so I underwent FGM, and that was the first time in terms of when I started questioning the difference between the two genders in this world that I was living in. So I was a British citizen, being taken to Somalia, subjected to FGM, came back here, was othered again. So at that moment, I understood that the reason why this was being dismissed, it wasn't because it happened in Africa or wherever it was was because nobody really understood. And that kind of journey to kind of get an understanding of what was happening led me to, in 2010, alongside when actually not a new wave of feminism, but a new age of feminism with social media and so on started up, to kind of connect with other women and to start to see the privilege that I had in order to communicate and use the platforms that I had to start talking about FGM and all these other things and actually mainstream the conversation. And thankfully, I think we've done that. I think this is one of the things that we can talk about in terms of women and standing in solidarity together. I remember when I first did my first FGM kind of standpoint, I wasn't talking about my own experience, because I'd learned, seeing women that had talked about their experience, how much backlash they got. So I always talked about FGM in a third person as this kind of thing that happened and should not happen. And I remember joining up with, I got an email from Kat Banyard, who was setting up UK Feminist at the time, and said to me, "Oh, do you want to come on a muff march?" I said, "Why not?" And it was around the growth of what was labioplasty, which is called labioplasty. But when you look at the terms of what actually happens to women's genitalia, it was actually equivalent to what the World Health Organization had defined in the 1980s as female genital mutilation. And I thought, okay, fine, let's all just join up together. And I remember making a sign saying "Mitts off my muff," and that got picked up. And the backlash that I got from both the African women saying, how dare you compare our experience to white women that pay and go in and to have this, and then from the white women saying, how dare you compare us to what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa through ignorance and through oppression and this barbaric practice. And I stood there in the middle, living in these two parallel worlds, thinking, actually, no, it's both through patriarchy. One of you is a girl, not educated, knows little about her body, therefore patriarchy within Africa defines your genitalia and how it should look. The other one of you is a woman, educated but knows little about her body, and then again she's kind of educated around her her genitalia by patriarchy. And that's when the quilt and the creative ways of actually talking about the female genitalia started, because what I saw was that as women, we talked about oppression against us, but not necessarily the key to all this oppression, whether it was rape, domestic abuse, and everything else. It was all to do with the fact that we had different genitalia to men. And I remember so we've got this quilt called the vulva quilt, and getting women to talk about their genitalia and so on. And then we got invited to, in 2012, to have this quilt at the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaes, which I've kind of named Fanny HQ. And and this was one of the most poignant moments. So I remember. So it was so it was February the 6th, is Zero Tolerance Day to FGM, an international day, and the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaes, which has never had a female president. That was the first shocking thing. I thought, okay, this is all about the female genitalia, but it's never had a female president. We were asked to bring our quilt to this area, and I got a call as I was getting off Liverpool Street Station, and I'm not sure if any of you are familiar or from London, but we have this great phallus-looking structure called the Gherkin in the middle of London, and as soon as you get off Liverpool Street Station, it's very prominent and it's there. And I got a call from the PR person from the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynaes, and he asked me, he said, Nimco, this quilt, how explicit is it? And I said, it's a quilt, and you should be seeing vaginas on a day-to-day basis, so it's not as explicit as the pictures and the things like that you see. He said, no, but I need to reassure the board, how explicit is it? And I said, as explicit as the Gherkin in the middle of London. And it was in that moment that I saw that our genitalia is so hidden, but so talked about and so defined for us to actually accept and so on. And that's why, in terms of the work that I've been doing, and social media has been very very helpful in that, because I can't be in two places at once. I haven't done that yet, but social media allows us all to be in one place at the same time, and it allows us to start the conversations about our genitalia and about oppressions against women within a creative way. So one of the hashtags that we've got at the moment is the FDL, which for an audience over 18 is the Fanny Defence League. For an audience under 18 is the Female Defence League, and we talk about, just like everyday sexism, we talk about things that we face as women and how creative we can be to talk about these things, because FGM is a very I think people have been shocked to talk about it, but I think humour has been a key way not to make fun of the actual oppression and what happens, but to actually talk about it in a way which is not derogatory or shocking, in terms of so we can all engage and actually say, it might not happen to me, but by luck of sliding doors, I could have been that girl. And that's the kind of conversation I hope we can have in this room.
Brilliant. Thanks, and I mean that speaks a lot to the power of literally putting yourself into your activism, but also some of the difficulties in finding common cause. So, brilliant. Okay. So we're going to turn to Mariana Katzarova. She's a human rights advocate and journalist, trained in international human rights and humanitarian law. She's originally from Bulgaria and founded the first independent newspaper in Bulgaria called Demokratzia in 1989. And she has also headed anti-trafficking policy unit in the OSCE, which is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so the big boys, and done work in terms of mobilizing a network of lawyers around supporting trafficking issues. She is also, if that wasn't enough, also the founder of Reach All Women in War, which she founded in 2006 after her experience of being a journalist in the former Yugoslavia and working in Chechnya. And she also, the organization Reach All Women in War also presents the annual Anna Politkovskaya, sorry, Russian names, award for women human rights defenders from war and conflict zones around the world. So welcome, Mariana.
Thank you very much. Yes, unlike Nimco, there was times that I couldn't really pronounce the word vagina. And I'm coming from a country where actually my compatriots still are having difficulties pronouncing the word vagina. I just on 14th of February organized for a second time after 12 years a V-Day in Bulgaria, in Sofia, And tomorrow, in fact, we are organizing a march of men who are going to wear female shoes on high heels, going through the streets of Sofia. It's called Walk a Mile in Her Shoes. So we've been trying. Yes, I've been wearing various different hats, and I've been working on trafficking, how to stop human trafficking, both at the UN and as advisor to Navi Pillai, the High Commissioner for Human Rights, also at the OSCE most recently. But really my passion has been the work of an organization that I started in 2006, actually together with Neris Lee, who is a colleague of mine and a friend who is sitting in the audience, an old colleague from Amnesty International. And why RAW and why we started doing what we did. I worked on Russia and former Soviet Union for 10 years at Amnesty International, covering 2 wars in Chechnya. And actually, interestingly, even mentioning it today brings me to the topic that maybe there will be another war in Ukraine and Crimea, as we know. So, having seen the 2 wars in Chechnya, having also worked in Bosnia, in Sarajevo during the war there, I really increasingly realized that there is a hidden story and hidden suffering, but also a hidden story of power, of the women's power. Because while the men are fighting or dead or locked up, prisoners of war during armed conflict, it's actually the women that are making up the majority of the refugees, the majority of the victims of this war, but also they are the activists, the journalists, the ones that keep the society together, the ones that keep the community going, and they're the ones that have to deal with the men if they come back after the war, either mutilated or traumatized, in any case traumatized. And the women's power and the women's suffering in war and conflict has not, in my mind, has not been a story that makes headlines very often. So we started RAW and War because women and people, everybody, men and women and children, feel really raw after an experience of war. RAW stands for having raw feelings after being raped or being tortured or witnessing the violence in war. It's also about raw truth and telling the truth and seeking the truth. It's about raw facts, about the story that is never really what one side is saying, the other side has a different story, and there is the story of the hidden suffering and the hidden power of women. So RAW is also the mirror image of war, visually, and as a state of mind and a state of being. And RAW is also reach all women in war. So the beginning of RAW was a lot of talks with my friends, including Anna Politkovskaya, the Russian campaigning journalist, and thinking how we can engage women from hidden conflicts, from places which are not on the spotlight of the United Nations or the media, such like Chechnya, for example. Anna was supposed to come to London so we could meet and discuss further what we can do in Chechnya. And then on 7th of October 2006, she was shot. She was shot in the head in the entrance of her apartment building. To this date, 7 or 8 years passed since then, the murderers and the ones who, most importantly, ordered the murder of Anna have not been brought to justice. And mind you, 7th of October was also the birthday of the Russian president, Mr. Putin, when she was killed. Clearly, Anna was killed to be silenced. So the truth about the suffering of civilians in Chechnya, in her war, is not going to be told. So it was really natural for me to think, well, what is the way to actually support women, such like Anna, in other conflicts, in other wars, who are right now trying to find out the truth and to tell the truth, risking their lives, speaking up for the victims and the survivors of violence. And we established the Anna Politkovskaya Award. For 7 years, we've been honoring women such as Anna in Iran, in Syria, in Afghanistan. Last year, the award was received by Malala, the brave young Pakistani activist who is actually speaking here tomorrow. If you're here tomorrow, come to our event, because we're trying to bring here, and thank you, WOW Festival, for giving us the opportunity. We're bringing brave women who either received our award or will be equally speaking about their work in war and conflict. It's called Refusing to be Silenced. Talking of activism without borders, I think what we have been trying to do with RAW and with the Anna Politkovskaya Award is to bring out the women's voices of women that are actually on the firing line. Our first award winner, and I'm not trying to be morbid, it's just the facts about RAW and the Anna Politkovskaya Award. The first award winner of our award in 2007 was Natalia Estemirova. She was a brave human rights activist from Chechnya. In 2009, she was abducted, and a few hours later, her body was found shot. Our Syrian award winner in 2011, a brave lawyer who turned into journalist in order to cover the atrocities happening in Syria, because as you know, the president of Syria has been keeping a blackout on the real story coming out of Syria. Razan Zaitouneh. 2 months ago, Razan was abducted in Syria, so we don't really know what's happening with her. We don't know about her whereabouts. Razan was abducted together with her husband and 2 other activists. Interestingly, by people that claim to be members of the opposition, fighting the president of Syria. So what the president and the regime in Syria was trying to achieve for so many years, and Razan was working in hiding, actually the armed opposition groups did more successfully. They abducted her because she was too liberal, because she was too human rights oriented, women's rights oriented. She established a women's center in the liberated territories outside Damascus. So these are really the women that I really feel humble about knowing them, honoring them, and this is really the activism without borders. But what I would like to see more is, with all this modern technology, and you're right, and it's also about where change happens. It happens nationally and locally. And now that we have Twitter, and Roy is actually live tweeting from this event, using this modern technology, we still need the old-fashioned solidarity. We still need the old-fashioned standing up for somebody around, on the other side of Earth who needs us. And I would like to see an uproar of tweeting, Facebooking, you name it, writing letters, sending pigeons, for somebody like Razan to be freed, for somebody like Razan to be brought back, if she is alive, if she and her colleagues still could be brought back to us. So let's stand up for these women and really be raw about it and be outraged. Thank you.
Thanks, Mariana. And I think in our discussion we're going to pick up on some of these themes because they're very important to discuss in terms of the realities of activism. So our last speaker is Judy Kosgei. She is just flown from Kenya, where she's a features writer and reporter for Citizen TV in Kenya. She's a young journalist and award-winning one at that. So she last year won the Thompson Foundation Young Journalist of the Year award for a really interesting story, which was looking at the issue of young girls in rural Kenya having access to sanitary towels and how that inhibits their ability, particularly to attend school. And she is also a CNN African Journalist of the Year, and has also won a UNFPA award around a television story around reproductive health as well. So I'd like to welcome you as our final speaker.
Well, thank you very much. When I saw the list of panelists who were here with me today, I was thinking, I'm this small, because the closest I've been to becoming an activist is I had gone to Somalia for a very long time, and I have dreadlocks, so I've covered them. So when I walked into the newsroom, my editor told me, "What's wrong with your hair? You look like an activist. You need to go." That's the closest I've come to becoming an activist. But every day when I wake up and I go to the newsroom, the question always in my head is, what will I do today? Will I be able to change a life? Will I be able to change a life, be it the life of a woman, the life of a child, the life of a young boy, an old man, or the life of anyone in Kenya or even Africa? So I always say, if you do a story and you don't change a life, then it's not a story at all. So when you sleep at night, what will you say I did? So for me, I think doing a story is always about the life that I'm going to change. At times I'll have to do stories, of course, political stories, which at the end of the day will not benefit anyone, will not change anything, will not get the corrupt members of parliament or politicians out, or will not get them be responsible for their deeds. But most of the time I make sure that I do the small story of the small person, that story that will always be overlooked in an editorial meeting, that story that you have to pitch and defend for 5 days, and then the editor will tell you, okay, fine, you're disturbing me, okay, let it run. But when it runs, always you'll find that the voice of the voiceless, the voice of that woman who may not be able to access maternity care, the voice of that woman who will have to walk for maybe 50 kilometers to get water because the money meant for a borehole, which was to be dug in their village, a politician decided that using the money for other things for his own benefit is better than sinking the borehole. So last year, I was able to go to one of the districts. First, I realized that during the financial year 2010-2011 by the government of Kenya, the money that was allocated for free sanitary towels, because there was a program that was introduced, was around 300 million. Then come the next financial year, that money had been cut off by almost 100 million. And the previous financial year, 99 million was cut from that money. So I'm thinking 2.5 million girls in the country need sanitary towels. The 300 million that was initially allocated was only going to cater for around 500,000 girls. So it was not enough. It was just a drop in the ocean. So I went ahead and asked, what is the criteria that you use so that you can give various districts the amount of money or the sanitary towels? And I realized that one of the districts which should have received the sanitary towels has never received the sanitary towels. And a cameraman who is a correspondent in that district called Baringo, in a county called Baringo in Kenya, told me that there are girls in villages around that, in that district who cannot go to school, who miss class 4 times, at least 4 days in a month, because they don't have sanitary towels. And they use anything that they can access, depending with the culture, because there are so many cultures there. Some were forced to use feathers, others were forced to, during your menses, you just sit down on soil until the 4 days are over. Others were forced to use hides and skins. So for me, as much as it came from, I grew up in a village, I knew people would use, old rags, clothes, and all that. I had never heard of that. I'd heard it in proxies. So I went and wanted to just talk to the girls and know how this happens. And what I found out was not even, it was worse than whatever I was thinking. Because one of the girls I talked to who said every time she has to borrow, if you're from her community, it's called the El Chamos. It's a small tribe in Kenya. So they use hides during their menses, but if you're not married, you're not allowed to own one. So if you're a young girl, you'll need to go to a married woman, borrow hers, use it, then take it back to her. Next time you borrow from another woman or from the same woman if she's kind enough. So she restricted that to the exam period so that she can be able to sit her exams. So during normal school going days, she would just stay at home, sit under a tree, somewhere far, far away where her brothers or father will not see her. So when we highlighted the story of the girls, there was one who was using feathers, another one sitting just under a tree the whole day and, avoiding the father. And your father or your brother should not know about it. So I call the story a period of shame because it's shameful. It's like your menses, something that is part of you, it's natural, it's so shameful, you don't have to greet your father should not know about it. Even if your father has so many, cattle and goats, you cannot even sell one so that you can be able to purchase sanitary towels, which the price is at times exaggerated in Kenya. So after doing the story, something very interesting happened. The politicians, of course, from the region said that was a lie. You exaggerated the story. That does not happen. But when they call me, they tell me, why did you have to talk about it? That is so shameful. It's like you were targeting us. You want to show the people that you're doing nothing. But ordinary Kenyans called the newsroom, so many of them. They called and they said, we need to do something. We need to stop this. We need to make sure that these girls can get sanitary towels. And luckily, my editorial director, Farida Karone, was very supportive, and he said, yeah, let's do it. Let's start a campaign and see how we can collect all these sanitary towels from well-wishers in Kenya, not from the government, from well-wishers in Kenya. And so a campaign with the help of my colleagues, one of them a news anchor called Janet Mbugu and Lulu Hassan, they came up with a campaign which was dubbed Inua Dada. That is, Inua Dada is in Swahili, which means elevator sister. So the Kenya Red Cross came in, and all their offices countrywide became like collection points for the sanitary towels. And guess what? People collected like sanitary towels that the girls will get for like 1 year, a year supply of sanitary towels in that district. And a few months later, the First Lady of Kenya was able to launch a campaign, and hopefully we will have a bill in Parliament soon. We hope that some of the women parliamentarians in Kenya will sponsor a bill which will ensure that it will be mandatory for the government to provide sanitary towels in all schools in Kenya.
Thank you, Judy, and brilliant piece of wisdom. If you do a story and it doesn't change your life, then it's not a story at all. So I have a few questions for you, and then we're going to open it up, so prepare yourselves for what you want to engage with the panel. So hearing you speak, I mean, it's wonderful to actually have intergenerational panels like this. Two things for me are bubbling up. One is about what activism takes. And it feels like one element is persistence to keep going, but the other is engaging risk. So I'd just like to ask you about that, because we know that there's a tremendous amount of risk in challenging dominant power, because dominant power wants to stay dominant. and will usually do anything it can to do so. And so I'm interested to hear from you in all of your different contexts, because it may be slightly different dynamics, your thoughts around how we sustain activism and how we handle that issue of both security and of risk as activists.
I think the fear of engaging is, so I'm just going to talk about from my personal perspective. In terms of the reason, so I'd been subjected to FGM, but then I was also immensely privileged, like, that was the only thing that I was subjected to, so I wasn't forced to be separately educated and all these other things. And I disengaged at the age of 11, because I kept on, so I had the most invasive form of FGM, and then I was defibrillated at 11, and then at 12, 13, talking to my counterparts, trying to get an answer to this thing. I was like, this is so horrible, this is so crazy, why are you guys not all rising together? And at that time, they were all like, it's fine, there's nothing actually wrong with this. And for me, I was really confused. So as a 15-year-old, I disengaged, and I thought there must be something else that happened to me that didn't happen to them. And what I didn't know at that time was the fact that I was lucky enough to not have all the other forms of oppression that they were facing. So they couldn't wear what they wanted, they couldn't go to the school they wanted, and all these things. And around me, I also saw that the women that raised the conversation of FGM were either stigmatized, othered, or actually ended up dying. So for me, it was like, society's going to have to do something about it because it's so abhorrent. They're not going to just excuse it for the next 20, 30 years. And then I remember, and then in 2007, for the first time, I engaged, because I went to a local school, to these young girls that had all undergone FGM, and unbeknownst to me, this was 2006. These girls were all born in the EU, and I thought, what's going on? And my first steps in talking about FGM was to engage with, child protection and so on. But it was only until 2012 when a young Sierra Leone girl wrote to the Evening Standard, and then also wrote to Equality Now, saying that her sister had been subjected to FGM, and she didn't want to go through this. And that letter touched me, but nobody wanted to raise that letter, because they were like, we need a real person to talk about their experience. And so I went in to speak, to do my first time I ever spoke, with my name, with my face, everything else. And for me, I thought, I know a lot of SHIT is going to come out of this, but it's only in the Evening Standard, it doesn't go online, nobody's going to really know, but at least I can help this one person. That was the first mistake, because the Evening Standard is online. And I also thought I'd be smart, because I was scared. And it's like, so I thought I'd be smart and I'll put a hat on, but the cameras are really good, so he zoomed in and you could see my face. And then I spelled my name with a K, but ultimately Google links the K and the C when you search the name. So this happened. So I went in, I talked about my story. 3 lines were attributed to me, talking about the fact that my mother was young and what she did was stupid, but essentially I don't blame her. That was all I said. And I'm talking about my own experience. So this girl's letters could be posted in the next day. That was Monday. By Tuesday, the most horrific thing, like emails and text messages came through. By Wednesday, someone had offered to kill me for £500. By the following few months, I was hit by a car, because I was that slag that talked about her own experience. And this was all to do with men objecting to the fact that I'd spoken about my own experience. And for 6.5 months, it was like literally the hardest, I couldn't go out, I couldn't do anything, and fear was one of those things that really set in. But then I also kind of understood that I was privileged enough to actually talk about these things and go home to Putney and close my door. There were girls out there who were going in for defibrillations and were scared every time the door opened. Has somebody found out that I've actually had a defibrillation? Has somebody found out that I've told my teacher that I've had FGM? So for me, the fear is still there, but I can only die once. And that's the kind of thing that keeps me going. It's a fact that I can only die once, but these girls are living in fear on a day-to-day basis. And essentially listening to what you said, the fact that these women that are standing up, that are risking their lives, but what happens is that we carry their story on. And it is the whole thing, if we roar together, one of us might be silenced, but we can't be silenced collectively. And I think that's kind of my experience in terms of being an activist.
Mariana?
You know what, listening to you and reading the paper this morning, why is the headline news again FGM right now when, when we have the Secretary General of the UN on a portrait committing, as if he never knew, or as if the United Nations, where I actually worked before, never heard about FGM. So only because The Guardian is doing this campaign, and Fahma, bless her, brave young activist, started this campaign with The Guardian, because of that, suddenly it's news.
I think it's,
today it's a news. Tomorrow it will not be a news.
I think that's a misconception.
And it really makes me, it makes me actually a bit angry, because it's this whole going in waves about, images and what the media says, and rediscovering major human rights violations, when it is Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General, it is the United Nations, it is the governments of all these countries that have to take a stand. And it is also about education and the community. But what I'm trying to say is your work, the work of other activists.
No, sorry, so can I just say that I think this is the thing about the media, and it's kind of like, ego to kind of present a story in a certain way. Fatima is somebody that I worked with. So Fatima is the third generation of the school where FGM was first disclosed. She's the oldest of 9 girls. Her mother broke the cycle by not cutting any of them and by actually supporting her. So in terms of the Guardian's campaign, this is in line with over 6 years of work that's been happening. And that's one of the things that the misconceptions is like the missing link. Everybody wants to be the first person to get the first FGM prosecution, get the first FGM story, without actually thinking that there's real children behind that. Fauma is 17 years old. Before that 17 years old, there were girls that are 22 now were the first girls that actually disclosed within that same school. So there's been a lot of work that's been happening, and that's thanks to people that don't want to take the spotlight. So I think, so I love The Guardian, but sometimes they need to check themselves that they're not the ones that brought this to the forefront.
But can I just say that it was about 12 years ago when for the first time not for the first time, but in a deep and profound way, I heard from a friend of mine who is a Maasai woman and who's been going for years from village to village in Maasai land to speak to the community, and she's been carrying a mannequin of a woman's torso, showing the people and explaining that if God wanted us to be without clitoris and without these body parts, God would have created us that way. So she has really changed the minds of ordinary Maasai, Kenyans from the Maasai community, and now she has a whole center where girls, 14-year-old girls, are going through, symbolically, through the ritual of womanhood without being cut. And parents are bringing them, not only the girls escaping, because she's been educating and changing the minds of people. So it's not today's news. It has been happening by brave activists, literally walking because she didn't have money for petrol or a car through Maasai land, right?
Yeah, but the problem now in Kenya is that there is a new generation of FGM. Gone are the days whereby we would know that the illiterate people, the illiterate women in those villages, the circumciser, and all those women who believe that girls have to be circumcised. Gone are those days, because those people have been talked to and they're like downing their tools, and they now understand. The problem is that the literate in the society, the lawyers, the doctors, the pastors, even some of those who call themselves the activists. And, I talked to a cameraman the other day, and he was a teacher. He's a trained teacher. Then he decided to go to journalism. And he told me, what? Actually, like last year, I cut my girls. I circumcised them. I asked him, what? And he's like, yeah. I'm like, but you've been doing stories telling Kenyans that it's wrong to do this. The disadvantages, the side effects, the health. And so now the problem is that maybe it's time we change. It's time to change how those activists work, because the people we target are not the people who are doing it. The people who are doing it are the people who actually know FGM is bad. They know the side effects and everything.
It's patriarchy 2.0, as I like to call it. It's the fact that they've changed the conversation. So it's a bit like how those so-called pro-lifers will use the conversation around pro-choice in order to kind of disempower us. It's the reason why FGM happens is actually to control women, is to actually give you fear. And I didn't know that. I used to think that, but I see it in action on a day-to-day basis with my niece. She's 3 years old and she's free and fearless. And if she's free and fearless, what she'll do is she will challenge these men out on their pedestals just because they have penises. And they need to break that, and then they need to mold her into a society, into the society of how she should be. And that is only the reason. That's the only reason why FGM happens. And that's just basically, that's why people think that FGM happens through ignorance, but if we look at the largest population of women affected by FGM, that's in Egypt. 1 in 4 women undergoes FGM is in Egypt, and 75% of the FGM in Egypt is medicalized. So we talked about barbaricalism as opposed to violence against women, and they said, okay, fine, if you think it's barbaric, then we'll legitimize it by medicalizing it. And now we have girls going to Harley Street asking for clitoridectomies, asking for unhooding, asking for trimming of the labias, because we have a society where porn tells women how they should look. So it's, when we talk about FGM and we talk about the women's genitalia, it's happening on a level where they're using our empowerment against us by using the media and everything else they have. So yeah, it is a next generation. Yeah. It's no longer about ignorance, it's actually about power. Yeah, it is power.
But also, isn't it about talking to the women? Yeah. Because, in fact, I witnessed FGM. It was some years ago in Yemen when I was working for Amnesty International, and I thought naively that I will go to this ceremony and convince the women, because it was just supposed to be women gathered in one room, the family of this baby, 6 months old, that, of course, women talking to women, how naive I have been. I could tell them it's bad, I could tell them it's torture, I'm the activist, they're women, they would understand, they would not do it. So it was one of the most horrendous experiences I had, and I've been to war zones, I've seen a lot of horrible experiences, but this FGM of this 6-month baby, so it was me and the baby screaming and crying hysterically, because it was just, I of course couldn't convince them. They laughed in my face. And there was this grandma with the rusty scissors doing it, who, we need to talk to the women somehow, but in some new way. And interestingly, maybe we as activists, or maybe what kind of activism we need in order to stop FGM from happening.
I just want to zoom back out because I don't want us to get too caught up in FGM in particular, and I want us to really think about this issue, though, of the protection of women human rights defenders. As we know, the United Nations has finally issued, its sort of statements recognizing that women human rights defenders face particular risks because they are women, challenging power in different ways. But it is in all of the activism that I've done and in a lot of the organizations that I'm a part of, I know it's an area that we still are really struggling to work out how to address, because we do face a tremendous amount of risk, sometimes to our lives, often to our social standing. We were socially marginalized, politically vilified, for challenging power. And that can be a woman who's, challenging a government. It can also be a woman in a house who's challenging an abusive husband, or articulating, a queer identity or whatever it is. So I think I just wanted to maybe turn to Anne, because you'd mentioned it about political control. You'd mentioned it in relation to technology, but I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to that in terms of what some of the risks we face as security concerns and perhaps how we can address them.
I think listening to the other women on this panel and some of the sort of extreme examples of risk to life, of practices which are definitely designed to control women, I think it's made me sort of think about the kind of the spectrum of control that exists across the world. In some societies it's more extreme and perhaps barbaric, if you like, than in others, but there is no society in the world where women are not controlled to some degree or another. And in fact, what I'm thinking is that, and what I'm observing, and what the reason your question before about, how do you keep going? And after 40 years at it, the answer is because you can't stop, because what got you started in the first place, unfortunately, is not only still there, but it's worse. And what really worries me as someone who's kind of observed and documented, because I write about this stuff all the time as well as being an activist, is that you can see that things are getting worse. So even in a country like Australia, which is a very privileged country and economically well off and all the rest of it compared with many other countries, what we are finding at the moment is that the levels of violence against women are rising quite rapidly. The levels of domestic violence are increasing. And one of the things that we are observing at the moment is that there's a lot of changes in our economy. A lot of old-fashioned areas of the economy, such as manufacturing, are closing down. So the sort of people who are losing their jobs are men, tend to be middle-aged men with very little prospect of getting another job. But their wives are working, and they're working in service industries, and so the wives are now the breadwinners. And there is this huge correlation in those situations between violence and loss of economic power, and therefore loss of face, loss of status, and taking it out on women. That's just one example. I think the other example that I would use, apart from the fact that we are not entitled to share political power, and one of the other things that I have documented extensively, which I'll be talking about on Sunday with Jude, is the fact that we had our first female Prime Minister elected a couple of years ago, and cause for huge celebration at the time, not just with women. Everybody thought this was fantastic, at last, one of the last countries to do it. And what we found, to our astonishment, was this unleashed, this is why I wrote a book called The Misogyny Factor, this unleashed this extraordinary amount of hatred, sexually based hatred, directed at this woman who was our Prime Minister. And there was no clearer example of the way in which women having power is deemed to be a threat to certain parts of our society. And I'm not saying just to men, because not all men are like that. Unfortunately, some women are like that. Some women, we know women collaborate in their own oppression. But they're they're two examples. And there's just a third and final example I'd give. And again, that's going to be the subject of another panel. But you mentioned, right to life. Women's ability to control their fertility is, one of the three fundamental rights that women must have. The other two are freedom from violence and the ability to control ourselves, to generate enough money to be economically self-sufficient if we choose to be. And without those three things, women are always going to be dependent and not have the ability to make their own decisions. And it seems to me the threats to women's reproductive choice, women's reproductive ability to choose, is under threat everywhere, and even in countries or in places where we thought the law was okay because the law had been changed. These laws are now being challenged. Even in where I live in Sydney, we have a law going through Parliament at the moment which would confer personhood on the fetus, and as we know, that is the first step then to taking away control from the woman.
Brilliant, thank you. And again, to just remember the issues of backlash. Now, I know that we started late. I have loads of questions for you, but I think we really should engage the audience. So I'm going to open it up now. And there are already hands up and now mics. So if you can raise your hands really high. Okay, so we've got 1, 2. Anybody else? Okay, so 1, 2 first. How does it, are there mics for them? There are? Okay. Oh yeah, there she is. Okay, brilliant.
Thanks, and thanks for the amazing talk. It's really, really inspiring. I'm going to address this question kind of in the light of FGM, but really for any kind of activism. I think it was really interesting how you talked about how the media needs to be careful and check itself because it's fighting for sort of the new story on FGM, it's fighting for the newest story, and actually it can forget that these are real young girls out there every day and this happening to them. And I think a good example of that was the Eleanor Mills in the Sunday Times story about uncovering the dentist who was offering it in England. But I kind of was wondering, I'm a journalist myself, and I was wondering what you would recommend we did, how we would tackle that, because part of me wants to, make the average Joe blogs aware that this is actually going on, because I think to, 99% of England that's quite shocking. But equally, how does the media avoid being that faceless thing who's just fighting for the newest story and the best story? And how do we say, this is awful and it's happening, but also look, it's a real human story?
The second question, the second hand up.
Yeah, it's a related question actually, because I just think, is there, you all obviously write brilliantly on your various campaigns, is there an argument for a central hub of a sort of alternative news source for men and women anywhere across the globe that want to find out about the other angle? And does that exist? I mean, do you know of a kind of central news agency that's offering this alternative voice?
Was there another hand? I think it might have been someone doing their hair. The lights are a little bright, so it's hard to see. Okay, we could maybe turn it to the panel. So there's two media-related questions. The first was about building a little bit on FGM, but we don't have to speak about FGM necessarily, but about how the media handles the question. And if it's just sort of, if I think, because we can't hear that well here, if it's just about sort of framing it in a sort of personal story way or looking at the broader political issues, and also if there's a central hub for alternative news, sort of from our perspective, and if not, if we need one.
I think in terms, I will just say that there's a talk in this room on Saturday about FGM, so you can come fill your boots then with all the questions, and especially about media. In terms of the media perspective, I think there's this need to, everybody thinks, oh, FGM is so wrong, we need to shock, rather than actually saying FGM it's wrong like rape, like domestic abuse, like everything else, and we need to actually understand and make and build on that. And I think that's the kind of the premise that we should be going for. Please stay away from shock, because we all know it's wrong, and shock doesn't engage, it just gets people to disengage actually. So it's about, and it's not about the victim stories, it's about the survivors. There's potential victims in this country, but there's thousands of women that are living with FGM, and they're also the women that are reading those. So it's about engaging that. So that's the main thing I'm going to say, and I'll kind of like stop there because there's going to be more on Saturday. And in terms of a central hub, I think it's about getting more women into like as editors and so on. So one of the key places where I found that there's a receptive in terms of actually having the conversation has not just about FGM but about all forms of violence against women, actually talking about women's stories and so on, has been on the New Statesman since Helen Lewis took over. And it's that whole kind of conversation where they did a reply to the Sun's have a grope for breast cancer. Did anybody see that, the front page? So there's been this collective against Page 3 and the Sun's male-led readership and also male-led editorial. Thought, okay, fine. How can we kind of flip that story on its side? Oh, let's link Page 3 to breast cancer, and its front page was about have a grope, and talking to men, have a grope to check for breast cancer. And there was a beautiful reply by Sarah, who's on the New Statesman, about women's bodies and women's genitalia and everything else. So I think it's about getting more women into the media as the ones that actually deciding what news is, because when men decide, then things become a little bit flippant. Like, for example, I'll use another personal story where we had an article in the Times, and some man objected to the fact that I talked about my own FGM and said, well, she didn't have FGM because I know her. And then I got a call from this newspaper's lawyers and said, can you prove that you had FGM? I said, well, I don't walk around with a certificate. And it's that kind of actually male-owned, media that we need to be careful about, because as soon as we start talking about our own experience, then we get questioned as opposed to getting supported. And that's the only thing that we can say as collectively, if we have the privilege to write, and that's why social media and blogging is also another way. If you can blog, it doesn't matter how many people that read it, but if one person reads it, I think that's what counts.
I actually wanted to say that when I was in Bosnia during the war, and you probably heard that as a joke because but it really happened, there was journalists coming to some of the refugee camps in Bosnia and saying, oh, is there somebody who speaks English who was raped and speaks English? So we could quickly interview them and cover the war in Bosnia. So, and that happened for real. I think, the story about sexual violence in conflict, in particular, rape of women, rape of men sometimes by opposing soldiers, is still, written in a way that it has to shock, or it's not written at all. I remember when Natalia Estemirova from Chechnya received our award in 2007, of course we're trying to bring the voice of our award winners. So we went around and we tried to publish her story about torture of civilians in Chechnya, sexual violence in Chechnya. Nobody was interested much, really, here in the West. Nobody was interested in publishing Natalia Estemirova's story. We translated it, we did everything. Because one journalist said, well, we've done Chechnya now, nothing really is happening there, much. And yes, this was a slow conflict, it continued, there was 2 conflicts in Chechnya, for example, continuing for about 10 years. It's still, in a way, continuing, still, but there's no news from there, we don't know what's happening. So, I think there is something to be said about how we educate the media, and I will slightly disagree with you. One of the group of biggest supporters of our Anna Politkovskaya Award, and we have about 100 very prominent people, have been the male journalists, have been the men war correspondents very often, and not so much the women war correspondents. It's interesting, isn't it?
It's a male privilege that he can write about whatever he wants, and she has to look for the biggest stories for it to be published.
Could be that, but I also want to say that they really have come a long way to come and support the voice of women, journalists and activists. But of course, it's up to who we're talking about, and it's about power. So I think we need to go and talk to the editors. We need to educate. How do you cover a story of sexual violence? How do you cover the story of really what's happening with women in war and conflict? And how do you cover the story of activists and human rights defenders? Not in a way that is just shock and awe, but it's in a way that contains this persistence of activism and also contains shows the power and the risk. Because it's always risky, as you said, to challenge the status quo. And in war, it comes to the forefront, so it's even more dramatic.
I just wanted to say one thing. The thing about the media nowadays, I work in the media, I'm a journalist. It's more of showbiz. It's about the numbers, the viewership, if it's TV, the readership, if it's the paper. So if I have 2 politicians yelling at each other and I've captured that on camera, saying nothing at all, nothing that will change anyone's life, or not even talking about the corruption deals that they're involved in. But if I bring that story and I bring a story about girls who cannot access sanitary towels, my story will die. The story about girls who cannot access sanitary towels, and the story that will be talked about, the 2 politicians yelling at each other. So it's very tricky even pitching a story on FGM, because you'll go today and you say, last year, I have this story. You say why you want to do the story, the objective, and why it's different, and why it should be told over and over again until something happens. The editor will tell you, no, find something else. Were you paid to do that? Are you paid to do stories on FGM? But back in your mind, that story will, if we don't keep on telling the story, we don't keep on reminding the government that they should have a legislation in place probably to take care of those women, to take care of those girls who cannot be able to go to school because they are married off early. So it's a big problem. It starts with the newsroom. It's not even about the editorial director probably being a woman. For me, it helped. The story on sanitary towel, the editorial director being a woman, because there's this program on Mondays, it's called Monday Special, and hard stuff are discussed. You bring 2 opposing politicians and they talk about, the party politics, they talk about money that was allocated, they yell at each other on national TV, and that topic will be trending on Twitter. But this Farida Karone was very persistent, and he said, we have to discuss this sanitary towel story on Monday special. And you know, the one person from the government side was brought, someone from the UNFPA, someone from, you know, we had all these stakeholders, and even a teacher who's been doing, you know, the little small things in a village school, being able to give the girls sanitary towels, but she could not because of the pay and the number of girls who need the sanitary towels, and even panties, because when we went there, we found out that we took sanitary. It's not right as a journalist. They say normally you should not be like tied to a story. You do the story and you move on to the next story. But when I was going to do that story, I thought, how am I going to talk to these girls? They don't have sanitary towels. Then after that, I just walk out of that village and I leave them. So I took like sanitary towels that would last the two girls for 3 months. But when we reached there, something that I had taken for granted, they didn't have panties. So how do you use the sanitary towel? It's not possible. So we had to go back and, you know, give the teacher some money to buy panties for the girls. So it's always about showbiz, what sells. If you put that on the first page of a paper, a story on sanitary towels, probably no one will buy it.
Oh, thanks. And maybe just on the question of, do we need a central alternative hub?
We could spend 3 hours, but this is such a huge question. I just to comment on what's already been said, I think the media, and I know it's different in this country because you have a lot more newspapers, you have a huge competition in the media here in a way that we certainly don't in my country and in most countries. And so the dominant model for the media is one that's very hard to challenge. And I find that when reporting anything to do with women, particularly violence and particularly rape, it's not just the shock value that they rely on, but they certainly rely on titillation. And, it becomes almost a kind of a pervy type of story. And a lot of rape instances in particular get massive coverage. And it's not because suddenly these newspapers have discovered, sympathy for women and what's been happening to women. It's because they have a titillating thing to it. What's the alternative? And the other thing about this fatigue, we've done Chechnya, or we've done this, moving on. This is another huge problem. And I think there are already lots of alternative medias arising, certainly in other parts of the world. I'm not so much sure about Britain. I have actually started my own digital magazine, partly in response to this, which you're welcome to look at ansummers.com.au online. And I've done it partly because I want to tell the stories that nobody else is telling, and they include a lot of stories about women. But I also want to do, and I think other alternative media does the same thing, is to go back to stories, to follow up and to follow through. And rather than having fatigue, because we've already reported this story and therefore, we move on to the next thing, I think readers actually want to know. They want to know what happened next. Is that person still alive? What happened to these girls? Did they get their sanitary towels, and did it change their lives? Did they go back to school? I mean, I think we do want to sense a sense of not just information, but a sense of kind of achievement and completion that we get from knowing what happened next. And if we're reading a novel, we want to know what happened next. We also want to know that with our lives and with society. And I think the media, certainly in my country, lets us down very, very badly because it doesn't do that. And therefore, those of us who can, and that's one of the great things about the internet and social media, is that you can now be your own publisher and it costs you virtually nothing. So we have the ability to actually compile our own news, and we all have plenty of news. We can get it from each other, and we can create central hubs without it costing very much money. I started my magazine for $70. That's what it costs to register the name.
And it's interesting, we're talking a lot about what our activism means facing out, so how other people are digesting it and projecting it on, and we're facing that challenge of how individualized the issues are. And I think we also need to look in, because I feel like we've often in our activism become very thematic, and sometimes we cannot hold the broader issue of a broader feminist transformation or a broader women's rights agenda as we focus on individual themes. And that's just an observation I have for my generation and younger. So it's interesting to see how we actually move with the broader political frame.
Can I just answer to my fellow panel member that Anna Politkovskaya was an activist journalist, and we actually call it human rights journalism, which I personally believe that all journalism should be human rights journalism. Like yours.
Great, thank you. Well, a very big thanks again to the panel. And a very big thank you to all of you for taking time, and sincere apologies again to the people who didn't get to ask their questions. I hope we're going to be here if you want to ask people directly, and also to definitely raise your questions in other spaces during WOW. So well done, people, and may feminists rock and move.